All right, hello. So today we're covering the chapter on mental content. We got about one more minute before we have to start. So let's share the screen. And then a quick housekeeping item. So let's get this slideshow ready. Oops. So the fourth quiz is now live, or will be live rather, once this lecture is over. This quiz is a little bit different in format from what you've had before. It doesn't feature any multiple choice or true false questions. So this one actually just has 4 short answer questions. The reason is that I've kind of run out of terms to test you on. And I want to ask you more questions about theories and concepts. So the quiz is still worth 20% or 20 marks, but it's just all short answer. And again, these just have to be 1 to 2 paragraphs in length. Each one is worth 5 points. So tell me 5 correct things in the answer and make sure it's well written and written in your own words, and you'll be fine. So that's the little bit of housekeeping. There's a question in the chat. Still 60 minutes. Yeah, still 60 minutes. However, it's not too late for me to add, I don't know, another 10 minutes or so if people think that that would be helpful. Because some people are quite fast writers and some people are not fast writers. Noah says that might be helpful. So yeah, okay, that's something that I can certainly do. Venance, go ahead.
Oh, that was perfect. Noah helped me out with that. Would be helpful too for me.
Okay, so what I will do is I will make that change as soon as we're done this lecture. I'll add, well, hey, let's just make it 75 minutes. Jill, go ahead.
Just a quick question. So this quiz is due by Friday. Then the next quiz, quiz number 5, am I reading it right that it's due by Tuesday?
Wednesday.
Or Wednesday?
Yeah, I think Wednesday is the last day. Well, let me double check the course outline, because there is a final day after which I actually cannot test you on anything. So where are we? Let's go to the course outline. Oh, it is Tuesday. Okay. Yeah, Tuesday the 18th. So as I mentioned, that quiz is not going to be as substantial as the quizzes that you've been getting. It's going to be more like a half a quiz. So there'll be less time, fewer days to complete it, but it's going to be like, it'll either be just 2 short answer questions or 1 short answer and 5 multi-choice true false.
But is it on what we're covering, chapters 7, 8, 9, and 10? Or wait,
it will
2
be
chapters. Okay, go ahead.
So it will be the 2 chapters we're covering this week. And unfortunately, I won't be able to quiz anyone on the final chapter, but the final chapter is just kind of a wrap up because it deals with consciousness, which we'll be looking at on Wednesday as well. But it connects it kind of back to the mind-body problem, which is sort of where we started from. So it'll be kind of like a light lecture, full circle sort of thing. Janita says, when should we expect the grades for the other quizzes? So I'm still working on grading quiz 3. 1 and 2 are available, but for quiz 3, I want to have those done sometime this week. So, okay. Okay, so those grades have been released. How are you guys trying to access the quiz grades? It's not in the grade book. Oh, maybe I forgot to connect it to the grade book. But there is a way to view, yeah, if you go to quizzes and then to feedback, I put instructions on how to do this on the Discord server. So, but I'll make sure to double check and make sure everything's connected to the grade book. However, yeah, if you follow those instructions that I posted on the Discord server, you should be able to view your feedback for 1 and 2. And then 3 will be available, I'm hoping toward the end of the week. Okay, so I think that's it for the housekeeping stuff. Oh, wait, there's one more question. Jill also asked, will the quiz next week be up any earlier? Yeah, I'm gonna try. I'm gonna try to have it ready over the weekend, which is not to say that you have to necessarily do it over the weekend. I don't expect you to write a quiz over the weekend, but you will have the option. So yeah, if that's everything, then we can get to the topic for today, which is mental content. Specifically, we're dealing with how mental states get their content. How do mental states represent anything, right? Now, this is actually a chapter that I did not teach the last time I taught this course. And well, the reason was that we just sort of ran out of space. Uh, so this was actually my first pass over this chapter, and it sure is a dense one, isn't it? So we're not going to cover absolutely everything in this chapter, but we're going to try to hit all the important points, especially when it comes to interpretation theory, causal theoretical approach. We're going to talk a lot about wide content, not so much narrow content, but a lot about wide content. How did you guys find this chapter? Okay. Jack says not too bad. Taylor does lecture first, then chapter, which is fine. Yeah, Jill says pretty dense. Yeah, I'd say I agree with that. It is quite dense. Yeah, I guess, but maybe Jack, the reason it seems unrelated, it might be because of the way I've taught some of the other chapters. I do think this is an important question. I think Kim's approach to it is not really what I would do. I would to try and make it a little bit more related to some of the stuff we've covered, I think I would talk about the language of thought and maybe the symbol grounding problem. But this is what we have. The reason I ask periodically what everyone thinks is because I'm not sure if I'm going to use this textbook next time around. I'm in a bit of a catch-22, right? Like if I use the same textbook, then that oh really? Okay. Well, man, that's fair. This chapter may be the weakest. That's fair. Yeah, if I use this again, then that saves me loads of time in terms of prep. But it is a very technical book. And a lot of the students taking this class are not necessarily philosophy students, right? So I've got a decision to make whether I use it again. I might not. I guess it depends how busy I am. How much prep work do I want to have next time, right? Anyway. Yeah, Jack, I had that thought before. This might be good for a 3,000, maybe even graduate school. Like if you're doing philosophy or maybe cognitive science and it's your first go at philosophy of mind, but you're already kind of at the graduate level. I've actually had that thought before. That this would be a good choice of textbook for a class like that, but I'm not sure if I'm going to use it again. So, in terms of things that we want to keep in mind for today, recall that mental states, and here I'm talking not just about propositional attitudes like beliefs and desires, although those are the main examples that Kim tends to focus on, have content. It's not to say they're the only mental states with content. I mean, emotions are not really propositional attitudes. They're emotions. And they have content. So all of these are intentional states. So they're intentional in the sense that they have intentionality, right? They're about things. They have content. They represent things. And because they have this job of representing things, they're subject to standards. Our representations, that is our mental representations, are subject to standards of justification and correctness. So they have epistemology, we could say. And usually we express the content of mental states such as propositional attitudes linguistically, right? We do it with we do it with propositions because a propositional attitude is an attitude like belief or desire that we adopt toward propositions. Propositions are statements about the world that can take on truth value, right? They can be true or false. I guess they can also be indeterminate, right? We cannot know the truth of a proposition, right? But we express them propositionally. So something like Josh believes that it is raining, right? It is raining is a proposition. Belief is the attitude, and they're connected with a that clause. So we express propositional attitudes linguistically using these propositions, which we are, that's also what we have these attitudes toward. Now, Kim asks, what is it about your hope and my belief, for example, that it is raining, that makes it the case that the same sentence can capture their content? We do not expect it to be a brute fact about these mental states that they have the content that they have or that they share the same content. There must be an explanation. These are the basic questions about mental content. So, how is it that our mental states can be about things? That's what we're dealing with today. This is not to say that humans are the only creatures with mental states, just because we are linguistic creatures and we can formulate sentences that capture propositional attitudes, right? Non-human animals certainly represent things in their environment, objects and events and so forth, and they can also represent internal states, right? That is to say, it's completely reasonable to say that non-human animals can experience like pain and pleasure or various emotions, maybe simpler ones than humans experience, but emotions all the same. I think it would be wild to say that they didn't. Obviously, animals need certain emotions in order to survive. Fear is a good example of an emotion that is almost certainly shared amongst human and non-human animals alike, right? But all these different kinds of creatures can have mental representations thanks to their brains and their central nervous system. And so we say that different physical biological states or physical psychological states are representative. They are content bearing. So certain states in my central nervous system, like the configuration of certain connections of groups of neurons in my brain and the activity levels in those groups of neurons, are content bearing because they represent information. They represent information about what's going on inside and outside of me, right? As Kim puts it, these physical biological states have representational content. They're about things inside or outside an organism and represent them as being a certain way, In a word, these states have meanings. A neural state that represents a bear is approaching means that a bear is approaching. Now, how is it that this happens? How do these states come to have the meaning that they do? And a related question to this first question is, how do we attribute contents to the mental states of what we could think of as intentional systems who have internal states that bear content? How can we attribute contents to those mental states? One answer comes from interpretation theory. So what is interpretation theory? Well, Kim has us imagine that we are anthropologist, linguist people, and we're perhaps investigating a previously uncontacted people, and we don't know their language at all. Not only do we not know their language, we don't have a dictionary because they're uncontacted, right? We have nothing to go on other than observing them. We can try and interact with them, but we won't understand each other. So we have to try and work out some things about these people. So what does our job involve? Well, Kim says it involves two tasks. First, we have to interpret their minds so that we find out what they believe, desire, and so on. And second, we have to interpret their speech so that we can determine what their utterances mean, what the things they say mean. This approach is what we call radical interpretation. We have to, in Kim's words, construct an interpretation of the native's speech and their minds from scratch based on your observation of their behavior and their environment without the aid of a native translator, informant, or a dictionary. And this is what makes it radical, the fact that we have nothing to go on. We've just stumbled across some people, and we don't speak their language, they don't speak ours, and we need to work out what they're thinking and what they're saying. Now, I think we can see how these things are interrelated, what we think and what we say, right? To understand exactly how, you have to pay kind of close attention to the notion of belief. And belief, in fact, is one of the variables we have to solve for here, we could say, right? Because all we have to go on is their behavior, namely verbal behavior, right? We can see them going around doing things in their environment, making tools, buying and selling or trading things, maybe gardening, growing some food, doing some farming, maybe some hunting, some gathering. So we've got behavior, ordinary behavior and verbal behavior. So we have to solve for the other two variables. One of those is belief. Now, how do we do that? Well, maybe we observe them for a bit, and we identify one individual whose name is Carl. And Carl reliably utters the phrase "s regnet" only when it rains in his immediate vicinity. He utters it when it's raining and only when it's raining. Like, okay, so I jot that down in my notebook. Interesting. Carl says "s regnet," it's raining. He only says that when it's raining, and only when it's raining here, where we are now. So I observe Carl some more. I observe all of his companions, and I formulate this hypothesis, R. So speakers of language L, that's Carl's language, utter S regnet at time T if and only if it is raining at T in their vicinity. Now I can establish this hypothesis because of my observations of Carl's and his companions' behavior. Now I formulate two more hypotheses, S. In language L, S regnet means that it is raining in the speaker's vicinity. So this deals with meaning. And M deals with belief. When speakers of L utter S regnet, this indicates that they believe that it is raining in their vicinity, and they use S regnet to express this belief. Now, S and M are both quite plausible, but what justifies our leap from R to S and M? Well, it's an assumption that what Carl believes is true. So we can see how belief, meaning, and behavior are all kind of interwoven in this scenario, right? I mean, we have here verbal behavior. Okay, so the speakers of L only utter S regnant when it's raining in their vicinity, and they only utter it at the time during which it is raining in their vicinity. So we can work out from that, well, okay, that must mean it's that S regnant means it's raining. That's the meaning of that particular bit of verbal behavior. And if they're using S regnant to indicate that it's raining when it's raining in their local vicinity, they must also believe that it is raining. So they're not just pointing at a state of the world, like, oh, look, it's raining. They're actually revealing something about what they believe, namely that it's raining. And if it is raining when they utter this, then what we've got here is a true belief, right? And we justify the connection between R on the one hand and S and M on the other with an assumption that Carl's belief is true, which we can see for ourselves because we're also there. Carl goes, S regnant. And we're like, yep, it is raining. I can see that, right? What we're doing here is we're applying something called the principle of charity. Kim puts that principle like this. He says, speakers' beliefs are by and large true. That's the assumption we're making. Moreover, they are largely correct in making inferences and rational in forming expectations and making decisions. Michael asks, what if Carl says, when it is raining, I'm going fishing. It isn't raining then, but he might say S regnant to express that thought. Yeah, but that would have to be embedded in a larger sentence, right? Like here, like the it is raining in your sentence, when it is raining, I'm going fishing. It is raining is embedded in a larger sentence that changes the meaning, or has a different meaning rather. What we're talking about in this toy example is just saying S regnant, not when it's raining, I'm going fishing, in the equivalent of that language, right? That would mean something else that we could work out with perhaps more observation. So everyone can kind of see how belief and meaning and behavior are interwoven here, right? And I assume that a lot of you, if not all of you, will be familiar with something like the principle of charity, right? I've also heard this expressed in the following way, where when we're operating under the principle of charity, what we are doing is assuming the greatest amount of truth that we can in another person's utterance. So that's the principle of charity that you might apply when you're listening to some person's testimony or reading some piece of writing, right? But we're assuming that speakers' beliefs are by and large true. It doesn't always work, right? Some people do have false beliefs, but we're going to assume that what Carl believes is true. In fact, we can confirm this for ourselves. We just look, oh, he says S regnant. Yeah, it is raining, in fact, right? So that's how we justify the move from R to S and to M. In this way, in uttering S regnant, Carl is expressing a belief about the current weather condition in his vicinity. And we assume, by the charity principle, that this belief is true. I mean, we could know this without applying the principle, though, so that's a bit weird. Like as I've been saying. The current weather condition is that it is raining. So Carl's belief has the content that it is raining, and he uses the sentence S regnant to express this belief, N. Whence it further follows that S regnant means that it is raining. And the same idea holds for anything that Carl could talk about. Events like the sun coming out, Well, sorry, my cat just very quickly ran down the stairs. It was weird. Objects and their properties. We can talk about those. And Carl could talk about those in his language. And by observing his behavior and applying the principle of charity, we could probably, on radical interpretation, work out what these things mean and what Carl and his companions believe. And again, I have to reiterate, this does not mean that Carl and his friends can't hold false beliefs if we're applying this principle. In applying this principle, we're assuming that his beliefs are by and large true. And on radical interpretation, we have to make this assumption if we're going to make sense of anything in Carl's world. Now, when we attribute a belief to Carl, like a true belief, like Carl believes it is raining, we mean it's also true, as Kim says, by our light. This is a little vague. Again, true by my light, I can look and see if it's raining when Carl says S regnant. This is probably the more important point from 231 and 232. An interesting conclusion follows from all of this, namely, we can interpret and understand only those people whose belief systems are largely like our own. Yeah, I get it. I mean, have you ever tried to talk to somebody with a drastically different worldview from your own? Let's see what the chat says. Taylor says, of course. Thomas says yes, or yup, technically. Tell us about it. What was that like? Jack says a bit rare, but always fun. Anyone want to volunteer an example? Okay, Taylor's got one.
Sorry, I couldn't find the raise hand button.
No problem.
I think a decent example is last summer when I took your philosophy of paranormal class, and I was like a Christian, and so like it was interesting to like write an essay about having to like question sort of like my own beliefs, because like certain beliefs like are that the doctrine, right? Like my final essay was a lot on that, where it was like, this is what I want to have faith in, but like, you know, here I am like now considering something like logic, you know, or like something logical. So I don't think it was exactly like a conversation, but it was like a whole class of being like, how does this fit in with my worldview? And like just kind of like seeing different sides of things.
Yeah, and you know, I'm sure you're not alone in that. You know, a lot of I don't really have any first person experience in this area, but I definitely have encountered people that come from a religious background and take a philosophy class, and it's, I imagine, in some ways like learning a whole new vernacular, right? Angelica says you can't even agree on what way to get into a store, for example, or even where to get the most basic necessities from. Or yeah, I mean, in some cases, my go-to example is when you talk to like a conspiracy theorist, which spare yourself the trouble, I guess. But you've probably heard a lot in the past. What? A flat Earth friend? Are you serious? Amazing. Amazing. Wow. Man. An example is the Jordan versus LeBron debate. Like who's better? Who's the best? Who's the GOAT? Okay. Yeah, for me, I'm like the anthropologist here. I don't know anything about basketball. I mean, I know that those two are basketball players, but that's about it. That's the limit of my basketball knowledge. Yeah, wow, truly believes it. That is wild. So yeah, when you're talking to somebody who's well, like I was about to say, you've probably heard a lot about echo chambers, like online echo chambers. And you know, somebody like maybe like a flat earther or some kind of conspiracy theorist perhaps is probably living in a different well, not they're not living in a different world. They have a different worldview than you. Um, maybe as much as you'd like to help a flat earther or a 9/11 truther or an anti-vaxxer, you know, it's hard to get them out of there, right? Uh, because you don't understand how they can be that way, and they don't understand how you cannot agree with them, right? That's kind of how I see this. Um, unfortunately, COVID-19 really created an opportunity for a lot more people to be permanently online. And the rise in conspiratorial thinking has been absolutely insane to me. I've said this in other classes, but before I was a philosophy major and I was spending a lot of time on like message boards and stuff, um, nobody knew who Alex Jones was. Now he's a household name. Uh, if people knew about Joe Rogan, it was because he was on Fear Factor or News Radio. Now, seems like a lot of people listen to his podcast, and he'll just, I mean, that guy will just talk to anybody about anything, which can be a good thing, but also can be not a good thing. Um, so yeah, that's how I feel about that. I better stop myself from going on a further rant about this stuff, though. I'll never stop. How about this example to try and make things more concrete? You see Carl eating some raw spinach. How could you explain his behavior? You could attribute to him a couple of different belief desire pairs, which might explain why he is munching on that spinach. Maybe Carl believes that eating raw spinach will improve his stamina, and he desires to improve his stamina. That would explain why he's eating spinach. Or maybe he believes that eating raw spinach will help him get rid of his bad breath, and maybe he's been very self conscious about it, so he desires to remedy his bad breath. Maybe he believes that eating raw spinach will please his mother, and he'll do anything to make his mother happy. Or he might also believe that eating raw spinach will annoy his mother, and he'll go to any length to annoy her. And there are many, many more such belief desire pairs we could attribute to Carl that would explain his behavior. Suppose there are two such schemes, like, I don't know, maybe the first two, and they explain Carl's spinach eating behavior equally well. So, on interpretation theory, each of these explanations have the same explanatory power. I mean, both of these, right? Say, let's just say for simplicity's sake, the first two would explain his spinach eating behavior. But which one is correct? How do we tell? We have two approaches that we could take. One approach would be something like this, where I'll get myself out of the way. Something like the following. We apply something like what Kim has written on page 233. For S, our subject, to have the belief that P is for that belief to be a part of the best, most coherent, maximally true, and so on interpretive scheme of S's total system of propositional attitudes, including beliefs, desires, and the rest. There is no further fact of the matter about whether S believes that P. And we can generalize this, by the way, so that it applies to all propositional attitudes beyond mere belief, right? And the important thing to note here is that if we take this approach, interpretation is constitutive of intentionality. It's not merely a means of finding out what somebody believes. It means that, you know, if it turns out that Carl, you know, if I say, for example, Carl believes that eating raw spinach will improve his stamina and he wants to improve his stamina, if I claim that that's the best explanation, it's because that belief and that desire is part of the most coherent and maximally true scheme that I can apply to S's system of propositional attitudes. So this is almost like a coherentist approach. I mentioned this briefly in one lecture, and I go into it in detail in well, what's the class I taught? Mind, World, and Knowledge, which I think I have some of those lectures on my YouTube channel. So if anyone wants to do a deep dive on foundationalism and coherentism, you're welcome to. But on the coherence approach, there's no foundational set of beliefs upon which all the other beliefs are constructed. Instead, everything kind of hangs together like a spider web. So this would be a coherentist approach. Foundationalist approach would be like Descartes' approach. You know, he starts with the cogito, I think, therefore I am, and he can build everything back up from there. That's a foundationalist approach. This is not that. This is a coherentist approach. Some would call this content irrealism. Why? Because it's our interpretation of S's behavior, and whether that interpretation is better, or whether our interpretive scheme is better than the next interpretive scheme, that's constitutive, that constitutes what his mental states are about. So that's why it's not realism, because we're saying that that's all there is to intentionality, the way that we interpret it. The way Kim puts it is like this. He says that if the existence of beliefs is genuinely indeterminate, we would have to conclude, it seems, that beliefs are not part of objective reality. Evidently, the same conclusion would apply to all intentional states. This is not to say that beliefs and desires and other mental states don't exist. When we say something is real in philosophy, we mean it's mind independent. But the beliefs that one has are obviously not mind independent, at least on this approach. They're quite mind dependent. You need a mind to have them, and you need another mind to interpret and make sense in the situation we have where, you know, Carl is a part of this community whose language we don't yet understand. You need another mind to come along and interpret the behavior and the mental states and the meaning of utterances to make it make sense to the interpreter, who also has a mind. So it's not to say that there are no beliefs. When we say that it's not real, or when we opt for irrealism, we're just saying it's not mind independent. That's what realism in philosophy of mind, at any rate, means. If there's nothing to eat but spinach, is there a belief involved? I'd say there might still be some beliefs. Maybe Carl has the belief that he is sick of spinach because that's all there is to eat. Yeah, and like Jack says, you'd have to believe that spinach is food. So there's two beliefs right there. This spinach is food, and I'm so darn sick of spinach because it's all I have. I got a big bag of spinach in the fridge, actually. I wonder what I'm going to do with it. Should wait till my partner gets home and just like start eating the spinach and get her to interpret my behavior. Oh, quiche. Yeah. Oh, yeah. Quiche would be awesome. Jill, go ahead.
A question on page 235. Kim mentions that content realism is, the way I'm interpreting it is that he's finding out the belief, but that we don't have to determine whether it's true or not. So how is this, how is the opposite of this? I'm thinking content How is it opposite?
Well, let's wait till we get to the realism part before we unpack that.
Okay.
Because the next approach is content relativism. Which I want to talk about before we get to realism or externalism. If we're like it's a little bit less simple than irrealism here being the opposite of realism, but I will answer your question once we get past this bit. So another approach we could try is content relativism. So if we take the content relativism approach, then as Kim writes, instead of accepting the indeterminacy of a belief and just, going with the best interpretation, the interpretation that that assigns, some belief based on what's coherent, consistent, maximally true, etc., we might hold that whether a given belief exists is relative to a scheme of interpretation. So this is similar to radical interpretation, but not exactly. So here's something like whether Carl believes that P depends on the interpretive theory that we apply to his system. What does it then mean for Carl's belief to exist relative to an interpretive scheme? Does that mean if I have one scheme, Carl might believe that P, but if I apply a different scheme, Carl has no such belief? What does that mean, right? How would we even know whether the scheme that we choose is the right one to apply? We would have circled back to this sort of non-relativized notion of belief where we don't have schemes competing against each other and we're back to content irrealism, which is not good. What scheme would we even apply? Folk psychology? What other options have we? Maybe scientific psychology, but who's really going to do that, right? Even scientific psychologists, once they leave the classroom or the lab, are using that folk psychology. So I'm not even sure what other scheme we might use. Unless what Kim means is some set of belief desire pairs. Admittedly, this is a little bit vague for my taste. Maybe that's why this chapter is seen as a little weak in some of those book reviews. In any case, here's another problem. Here's what Kim says on 234. Interpretation involves an interpreter, and the interpreter herself is an intentional system, a person with beliefs, desires, and so forth. How do we account for her beliefs and desires? How do her intentional states get their contents? And when she tries to maximize agreement between her beliefs and her subject's beliefs, how does she know what she believes? That is, how is self-determination possible? Don't we need an account of how we can know the contents of our own beliefs and desires? Do we just look inward and are they just there for us to see? Or do we need to be interpreted by a third person if we are to have beliefs and meaningful speech? You can see how there's a risk of an infinite regress here, right? So to avoid circularity or an infinite regress, interpretation theory has to, that should say contend rather than content. It has to contend with the problem of self-interpretation. So you might want to reject the irrealist or constitutivist views we've been considering here, and the relativist versions as well. You might not opt for interpretation theory at all. You might, on the other hand, opt for content realism, which is what Jill was talking about a moment ago. On content realism, interpretation is not constitutive of intentionality. It is a tool. Its value is epistemological because it allows us to find out about the intentional states of others. And we say that those actually exist independently of my mind. Well, Thomas, that's kind of the problem that Kim is gesturing at. Like, okay, so how do we make sense of beliefs? We have to interpret them. So if I want to make sense of Carl's belief, I can go with the constitutivist or the relativist versions, but either way, I have to find a scheme that explains Carl's belief. And just by interpreting his behavior thusly, I attribute to him a belief. But if I take the relativist version, well, what I'm using is some scheme that I have, but I'm also an intentional system. So how do I make sense of my beliefs? Do I need an interpreter for me to make sense of my beliefs? How can I self-interpret? Right? That's a problem. So you might just want to go with content realism of some kind or another. So how are we doing so far? We're about to look into a couple of different versions of content realism, where I guess to try and answer Jill's question from before, if you're a content realist, then what you're doing when you, let's go back a slide, what you're doing when you interpret someone's behavior in order to tease out a belief, you're using interpretation as a means to find something out, in their minds, rather than just saying, well, my interpretation of Carl eating those spinach leaves, the interpretation on which he's eating it to annoy his mother is the best, the truest, the most coherent, and so forth explanation, which means that must be what he believes. And that's constitutive of assigning that belief to Carl. But here, content realism says, no, Carl does have some belief or another. There is a fact of the matter. On irrealism, there is no actual fact of the matter, what Carl believes and desires, which is kind of weird, right? But on content realism, there is. And interpretation is a way of finding that out. So, everybody kind of following me so far? I am moving a little faster than I wanted to. So I'll stop for some question. Michael asks, is there an observer effect involved? Observer changes the system situation observed. Not quite like, not like double slit experiment observer effect, but there's this line from Sartre, Jean-Paul Sartre, the seeing eye of the other. My master's supervisor, Heidi Maybaum, used to use this all the time. Like, when you realize you're being watched, you don't behave like you would when you're not aware of being watched, right? Yeah, Jack, exactly. The keyhole example. That's where this is from. The seeing eye of the other. So imagine like Sartre does, you're spying on someone through a keyhole, and then you realize that someone else is spying on you. Weird. You're going to be like, they caught me, right? The seeing eye of the other. Think of it this way. You ever do stuff when you're by yourself at home that you realize would be super embarrassing if someone were there? And you don't have to share a specific example, obviously, but we've all done it. I'm walking around singing a made-up song or repeatedly quoting a line from a television show I've seen. But if someone were to walk in and see me doing that, I would think that they would think I'm insane, right? So it's that kind of thing. Do we have to worry about this in our anthropological linguistic thing? For the purposes of this chapter, no. We can just say, like, we don't have to worry about that. We could even say our anthropologist / linguist has some kind of cloaking device. I don't know. Maybe it's like a science fiction kind of Star Trek example, and maybe I'm observing the locals, but I I pull a Star Trek and I go down and I look like one of them, or I am invisible to them in some way. So that we don't have to worry about the observer effect, or as I prefer, the seeing eye of the other. Okay, so good. That was a good question. Now, on to content realism. Sorry, I've just got a text. Now, content realism. Here's where we get into some fun thought experiments. Imagine a scenario like the following. Oh, I just remembered I had a dream of a frog. Oh, I bet it was because I was prepping for this lecture. There was this weird frog, like a bullfrog, like this big giant frog in my dream. And yeah. Okay, so imagine you're a frog. Flies across your visual field, and the frog represents the fly moving past. The content of the frog's representation is the fly. Now, frogs don't have the best vision. So if you're a frog, you can imagine your frog representation of a fly being like a black dot buzzing across your visual field. And you're a hungry frog, so naturally you grab it with your tongue and you eat that fly. But imagine there's another world. In this world, there are frogs, but there are not flies. Instead of flies, there are schmies. And these schmies are not insects, but rather tiny flying lizards. They very closely resemble flies in terms of appearance and behavior. Now, this frog in Schmei world has the same thing, a small black dot buzzing across its visual field. It eats it, delicious Schmei. But what does it represent? Well, its representation, even though it is pretty much identical to the earth frog's representation, what does it represent? It doesn't represent a fly, it represents a Schmei. So here's how Kim puts it. He says, from the frog's internal or subjective perspectives, there is no difference, we may suppose, between our frog's perceptual state and the otherworldly frog's perceptual state. Both register a black speck flitting across the visual field. However, we attribute different contents to them, their representations, and the difference lies outside the frog's perceptual systems. It is a difference in the kind of object that stands in a certain relationship to the perceptual states of the frogs. Moreover, our frog's perceptual episodes involving a flitting black speck indicate or mean the presence of a fly. Qualitatively indistinguishable perceptual episodes in otherworldly frogs indicate the presence of a schmei. So we can see what's happening here, right? We have an earth frog and a otherworldly frog. And for the purpose of this, for the purposes of this thought experiment, their representations of flies and schmeis are pretty much identical. But why does one represent a fly and the other represent a schmei? Well, it's got nothing to do with what's going on in here. It's got to do with features of the frog's respective worlds. You could put it that way if you wanted to, but we're supposed to be able to scale this up to intentional systems like us, which we'll see when we get to the twin Earth thought experiment. This is kind of like working our way up to that. Like, obviously, these frogs wouldn't have words for flies and schmeis. It would be food for either one. But we want to use this example to kind of eventually get up to twin Earth, where we're going to have water and XYZ. And we're going to be dealing with people, which are much more sophisticated intentional systems than frogs. The point is that and there are a few other examples that Kim gives, but we won't go through all of them. The point is that the intentional states of frogs, people, whatever, get their content because there exists a lawful correlation between their internal state and the world. and this, the way the world is, causes an internal state which can serve as an indicator of either a fly or a schmy, depending on which world we're on. And this is an example, albeit a simple one, of the causal correlational approach. Now try and think of some other examples of these, I guess in Dretski's words, representations that are reliably caused by these law-like or lawful correlations in the world. Think of colors or the other properties of objects, for example. But give me an example. Let's have an example. It could literally be something on your desk. Taylor's got nothing. Okay. All right. Let's go to the cube. So again, red, right? Mouse. Yes, mouse. So this mouse has certain properties, its shape, its functionality as well, which correlate to reliably correlate and also cause an internal representation of a computer mouse. I was going to use my cube. So red. Remember when we talked about qualia and the inverted spectrum? We learned that the experience of red is reliably caused if nothing like the inverted qualia argument holds. You know, if we don't have to worry about inverted spectra, then red is reliably caused by light with a wavelength of like, 700-ish nanometers, right? Those physical things cause the perception of red, such that every time light of that wavelength strikes my retina and causes my rods and cones to phototransduce the light into neural signals, and it goes to the visual cortex, and all that magic happens. Every time that happens, I will see red. So you could say that light with a wavelength of, I don't know what it was, 740 nanometers, something like that, is an indicator of red. I believe, I don't know why Kim doesn't use this example, but the example that I learned was that fire represents smoke. Or no, oh, I've got that back. Smoke represents fire, right? Fire is a cause of smoke. So in that sense, we can say that smoke represents fire. That's the causal correlational approach, right? I'm kind of thinking that maybe Kim has come up with a lot of original examples in this chapter to try and make things interesting, and that's good. But I mean, you can't really get any simpler than fire represents smoke, or thunder represents lightning, or something simple like that. Because lightning reliably causes thunder, right? Lightning is super hot. It causes the air to expand rapidly, which causes a sonic boom, which we hear as thunder. So that even if I don't see lightning, I can hear the thunder and I can know, oh, well, there was some lightning that made that happen, right? So thunder means lightning. Light that's, 740 nanometers in wavelength means red. Smoke means fire. This approach, the causal correlational approach, is also known as informational semantics. Here's how Kim puts the way in which we could attribute beliefs to people on this approach. He says, subject S has the belief with content P, that is, S believes that P, just in case under optimal conditions, another escape clause there, S has this belief as an occurrent belief if and only if P obtains. And we're restricting this to observational beliefs, right? We're not talking about other kinds of beliefs. Observational or perceptual beliefs, I think, would be a better term. So I have the belief with content P. Say I believe that it is raining. Just in case, under optimal conditions, I have the belief that it is raining, if and only if it actually is raining. So I have the true belief that it is raining, if I believe that it is raining, if and only if it is raining. Now, there are some kind of fun objectives that Kim offers here that you can take a look at on page 237, 238, and 239. We won't go through them in detail here, but some of them are kind of fun. I like the one about horse parts. Like, the belief that there are horses in the field doesn't mean that I also have the belief that there are horse parts in the field. You know, I just believe there are horses in the field, not that there are just jumbles of horse parts. Yeah, there are tons of those. Check them out if you want. One thing I want to draw your attention to is what this approach says about qualia. What do you think? Anything about qualia? Not much, right? I raise this because we've just been talking about functionalism so much, and functionalism kind of um, doesn't really say much about functional or about qualia. Um, this is kind of like that. It's great if we're talking about, you know, working out what people believe or what the contents of their intentional states are, but it seems to leave out something important, doesn't it? Which hopefully we'll get to next time when we talk about consciousness. What do you think? What do you think? Somebody better say something. I know we're getting to the end of the class and we're tired. We've probably got multiple courses on the go. What do you think? Jack, go ahead.
I think I don't know, it seems like qualia is kind of just the boogeyman for a lot of these physicalist views we talk about. And yeah, I struggle to see how you would even kind of fit the notion of qualia into this kind of view. I don't even know really where you would begin. So I guess in a lot of ways, I don't have a lot of thoughts on it.
Yeah,
I guess the fact that I don't kind of signals a bigger problem for these kinds of views.
yeah, maybe. I mean, as we'll see next time, some people are going to deny that qualia are a thing. Um, so, you know, but Michael says, back to the frog example and related to qualia, are we saying that we believe the frog could distinguish between a mosquito and a fly? Or would the frog just believe either to be food? How do we know what it believes or which is represented in its mind? Well, on this approach, we're assuming that it's representing something and that there is a fact of the matter about what it's representing. Although what it's representing might be partially determined by not just what's going on inside the frog's mind, but also what's going on in the environment. On the interpretation approach, what the frog believes is whatever we interpret it to believe, whether it's a fly or a schmy or a mosquito or a schmushmito. I don't know. I just made that up, right? But yeah, you're right. Like, the frog, I mean, let's be real about frogs. It's probably just the frog equivalent of food, like you're saying. But remember, the point is we're using this as a toy example to try and show how content might be fixed by your local environment, not just what's going on in your mind, as it were, right? That's what we're doing here, right? And speaking of what it's representing, like, is the frog, maybe it is a mosquito, but the frog misrepresents it as a frog, as a fly. Maybe it's not anything at all. Maybe it's a falling stone. Maybe I'm tossing tiny stones and the frog thinks food and it eats it. And then it's like, oh, that's not food. And then it spits it out again, right? The frog has misrepresented things. Mental states, because they can represent, means that they can also misrepresent. Sometimes we get things wrong. This is an example that I used previously, but imagine I saw a stand of, I don't know, this tree looks, well, it's not a tree. It looks kind of like maybe some kind of spruce or jack pine or something, but maybe I see a group of trees and hidden amongst them is this structure, which is actually a cellular tower. And they apparently they make them look like trees now because regular cellular towers are kind of unsightly. So we dress them up as trees and we have this fake tree blending in with the other trees. And I look over at a group of trees, which is called a copse. A group of trees is called a copse. And I go, look at that tall tree in the middle, when really that tree is this imposter tree right here. I would have misrepresented this imposter as I don't know, a spruce tree or a jack pine tree or something like that, right? So implicit here is the idea that mental representations have a job or a function to do, right? They, as I mentioned at the beginning of the lecture, are supposed to provide correct representations of what's going on in and outside of us, correct representations of objects, states of affairs, etc. Right? So that means that they can go wrong. Who has had a curious case of misrepresentation where you think you see something and then you realize it's not that, it's something else? Well, I don't know if fault is the right word, Taylor. I would say sometimes both. I mean, think of camouflage, right? You guys have probably walked by so many creatures. If you go for walks in the park like I do, you've probably walked by many creatures that were right under your nose that you didn't even see. Insects, birds, all kinds of things. Because of camouflage, right? And sometimes you have to look pretty close. You know, oftentimes, I've looked in the water and I've seen just something floating there like a piece of driftwood. But then I look closer and it actually is a group of turtles or something, right? Or like Thomas says, thinking water was ice near the end of winter. Yeah, because you're thinking, winter, ice, and you look out, look at that ice. Oh, wait, it's actually water on closer inspection. Yeah, camouflage causes the viewer to misrepresent what she is seeing. You might misrepresent an insect as a stick when actually it's an insect, right? And that's the job camouflage is supposed to do, in fact. Yeah, go ahead, Taylor.
So I just thought about that and I was thinking about like mirages. Are mirages technically misrepresentations? And like you could talk about just like a general mirage, like on the top of a road, like a warm road when you're driving, but you could also equate it to like the Titanic and like the mirage theory of the Titanic, right? So it's like, are those considered misrepresentations or are those like, I don't think I understand like the difference between like a mistake and a misrepresentation.
Same thing. A
Okay.
perceptual mistake, it
Okay.
could be a kind of misrepresentation, right?
Gotcha.
Mirages, I would say yes, are a kind of misrepresentation. Like the road one is a good example, right? Where it looks like there's some water there or some oil or some glistening liquid, but actually it's just the way the light is being refracted because of the heat in the atmosphere. Likewise, I've heard the Titanic theory as well, where the atmospheric conditions obscured the iceberg, so they misrepresented the environment such that there was no iceberg when in fact there was an iceberg, right? Michael's got a good example. Words and songs can be misrepresented. Yeah, totally. Like, you ever check out any of those misheard lyrics videos that people used to do? And they'll put the song on, make a video, and in the captions they'll put the misheard lyrics. Or that bad lip reading guy. Similar idea, but not exactly. Yeah, those are good. His stuff's gone. I'm not gonna lie. I think his stuff has gone way downhill. His early stuff was amazing. Later stuff I'm not as big of a fan of. But yeah, the wrong lyrics. Yeah, I like. That's how I got into that band Nightwish. Was a misheard lyrics video for their song Wishmaster, and the lyrics are just the misheard version is it works because they're from Finland, so their vocalist had a thick accent, so it was easy to mishear what she was singing. So yeah, those are fun. So the idea, again, getting back to the slides, is that our representations have a job to do. This is where Kim writes, the teleological approach comes in to help out. The basic concept employed in the teleological approach is that of a function. For representation R to indicate and thus represent C, it is neither sufficient nor necessary that whenever R occurs, C occurs, holds. Rather, what must hold is that R has the function of indicating C, or to put it more intuitively, R is supposed to indicate C, and it is R's job to indicate C. Your representation has the content, there are horses over there, say you're looking at a field of horses, and not there are horses or cows in the dusk over there, because it has the function of indicating the presence of horses, not horses or cows in the dusk. And misrepresentation happens when representations don't do the job they're supposed to do, when they're mistaken or otherwise erroneous. But what determines the function, the end, the telos of mental states? Well, most philosophers these days are naturalists. So they would say it's evolution and natural selection which fixes the function of our mental representations, right? So R's function is to represent C because R was selected for in order to represent C. Notice we can still have misperceptions. I mean, my favorite example is, imagine back in the day in our hunter-gatherer past, when we were still wandering the savannas, right? Maybe you're out and about hunting and gathering, and you hear a twig snap in the bushes behind you. You've kind of evolved in such a way that kind of thing gets your attention, because it could be a predator. Imagine if you hear it snap, you hear a twig snap, and your brain has evolved to attend to something like that. So we have like a sudden twig snapping might mean a predator is following me, right? You turn around and it's just the wind. Okay, nothing to worry about. But compare that, so you've had a false positive. No big deal. That's a lot better than having a false negative, where you hear a twig snap, you ignore it, you think it's the wind, but actually it was a saber-toothed tiger and it eats you. Now you're not going to pass your genes on, and you're dead, basically. So they have a job to do. They don't do it perfectly. They do it good enough to facilitate survival and reproduction. But even if evolution turned out to be wrong, which it probably never will, but even if you're a theist or something, as Kim says, the teleological approach is still good. You could just say that, oh, well, God made it so that whenever R occurs, C occurs, right? That's the idea. All right, so where are we now? We're going to get to the content externalism. We're a little over halfway through the slides. So how about we take a little break? And let's see, it's 3:48. Why don't we come back at about 5 minutes after 4 so that we have just a little over 15 minutes to grab some coffee, take a little bio break kind of thing. Sound good to everybody? All right. Excellent. Very good. Let us do that. And I'll see you at 5 minutes after 4. Okay, we're back. And let's reshare the screen. And we're going to try and get through the remainder of the slides, which we should have no problem doing. So the causal correlational or informational semantics approach that we reviewed right before the break highlights something important. What does it highlight? Well, Kim says that it highlights the fact that content has a lot to do with what is going on in the world outside the physical boundaries of the creature. So this is what was supposed to have been illustrated by the fly schmy example. If we follow the rules of the thought experiment, the internal states of the frog are identical. In order to differentiate between a fly representation and a schmy representation, we have to look at the world and the way the world is. In one case, it's a fly, but on the other world, it's a schmy. Now, when we differentiate between representations like this, when we differentiate between them by referring to the conditions of the external environment that the intentional system is embedded in, we say those representations have wide content. But alternatively, Kim writes, we may say that the content of an intentional state is narrow, just in case it supervenes on the internal intrinsic properties of the subject who is in that state, and that it is wide otherwise. So if the content of the representation also supervenes on features of the external world, we say that it's wide. If it does not, we say that it is narrow. Now we're going to look at another thought experiment which argues in favor of content externalism, the idea that mental states get their content from the environment that's external to the intentional system. In other words, content externalism has it that most, maybe even all of our beliefs have wide content. And this is where we come to Twin Earth, which is due to Hilary Putnam. This is from Kim, but he summarizes Putnam's thought experiment quite well. So Kim writes, imagine a planet, Twin Earth, somewhere in a remote region of space, which is just like Earth, just like the Earth we inhabit, except in one respect. On Twin Earth, a certain chemical substance with the molecular structure XYZ, which has all the observable characteristics of water, it is transparent, dissolves salt and sugar, quenches thirst, puts out fire, freezes at 0 degrees C, and so on, replaces water everywhere. So lakes and oceans on Twin Earth are filled with XYZ, not H2O, what we call water. And Twin Earth people drink XYZ when they are thirsty. They bathe and swim in XYZ, do their laundry in XYZ, and so on. Some Twin Earth people, including most of those who call themselves Americans, speak English, which is indistinguishable from our English, and their use of the expression water is indistinguishable from its use on Earth. Now, okay, so that's the setup. Now, this can be a little tricky, so let's make sure that we're all on the same page so far. Twin Earth is exactly like our Earth in every respect. It has the same continents, it has the same countries. You have a twin on Twin Earth, like I'm regular Josh, but on Twin Earth, there's twin Josh. There's a twin philosophy class happening right now on Twin Earth with all of your twins in it. The only difference between our Earth and twin Earth is that instead of water, what they call water is not water. It is this substance that we'll call XYZ. And when we talk about water, we are referring to H2O. And when the people on twin Earth talk about water, they are referring to XYZ. Are we all clear so far? I know that XYZ is just a made up thing. It's not a proper chemical designation of anything, right? Just for argument's sake. Okay, good. Jack's good. Noah's good. All right. Who's not quite following? It hasn't got too tricky yet, so hopefully everybody's following along. But stop me if you have a question. So this next part is very important. Here's the difference. The twin Earth water and our water mean different things, as I mentioned a moment ago. When a twin Earth inhabitant says water is transparent, what she means is that XYZ is transparent, not that H2O is transparent. The same words, when uttered by you, however, mean that water is transparent. H2O is transparent. The word water from a twin Earth mouth means XYZ, not water. And the same word on your mouth means water, not XYZ. Now, what can we conclude from this, at least when it comes to content externalism? Him says, we have to conclude then that that the twin Earth word water and our word water have different meanings. Although what goes on inside the minds or heads of twin Earth people may be exactly the same as what goes on in ours, and their speech behavior involving their word water is indistinguishable from ours with our word water. So like the frogs, right? There's a frog on our world that sees a fly and represents a fly, and there's a frog on Shmai world that sees a Shmai and represents a Shmai. What's the difference, even though their internal states are the same? It has to do with their environment, the environment external to the organism. Same thing here, except we're more sophisticated than the frogs. So we have words like water, and on our Earth, water refers to H2O. On twin Earth, water refers to XYZ. So water on twin Earth and water on our Earth mean different things because they refer to different things. So Angelica says, because the physical and literal content of the words are different, they have different meanings. Yes, they mean different things because the content is different, and the content is fixed by the environment of our Earth and twin Earth, respectively. Yes. Michael says, sounds like multiple realization for the concept of water. Yeah, I mean, in a way, I mean, maybe XYZ is functionally water. But because it is a different physical realization, what we mean when we use the word water means something different than what water means on twin Earth. Well, it doesn't quite reduce, I mean, that's a good point, Angelica. I don't think it reduces meaning right down to physicality, but it does show that meaning is kind of extended outside of the bounds of the organism. So I have mentioned previously 4E cognition, right? I'll type this in the chat, 4E cognition. And this means that cognition is extended, it's embedded, embodied, and enacted. Make sure I spell all that right. So that's something to take note of if you're curious about some of the stuff that's going on in philosophy of mind and cognitive science right now. So cognition, or thinking, mentality, if you like, is extended outside of the bounds of the organism, and that organism is embedded in an environment. That's how cognition can extend outside of it. It's embodied, because we're embodied creatures, and it's enacted, meaning, at least on the perceptual side of things, when it comes to perception, it's not something that passively happens to us. It's something we do by taking advantage of our sensory motor affordances and the features of our environment. So Michael asks, how does it compare with the multiple realization for the concept of mind? I don't think it's a comparison that we can really draw here, because we're not talking about what minds are. We're talking about how what minds represent have the meaning, how those representations come to have the meanings that they do, right? So that's the difference. Like, yeah, you can think of it in terms of like, oh, XYZ is functionally like water, but the people on Twin Earth, when they say water, they don't mean H2O, they mean XYZ, because they don't have H2O, they have XYZ. Well, there's not, when it comes to multiple realizability, there's not a difference there, but we're not applying multiple realizability here. Like, we don't need to. What we're doing is asking where the meaning of the word water comes from. And if content externalism is right, the meaning of the word water is fixed by features of the environment, namely whether you have H2O or XYZ. So that's what this is meant to show. I mean, the point isn't, it's not really about water, the word. It's about what I represent when I think of water. H2O or XYZ. What do I mean when I utter the word water? H2O or XYZ. Depends on whether I'm on this Earth or Twin Earth. Angelica says, if I experience pain and someone else experiences pain for the same reason, if they were to characterize it as emotional sadness or something, we'd be experiencing different things. No, not exactly. This would be narrow content, because it's all internal, right? But yeah, I see you see what I mean. Like, it's like, what do words mean? Well, it's partially determined by what's out here, right? Like, I could be like, pass me the guitar, right? And so you pass me a guitar, right? But maybe on Twin Earth, guitar doesn't refer to a six-string instrument. It refers to I don't know, some kind of woodwind instrument. So the meaning of the word on Twin Earth for guitar might pick out what we call a saxophone. I don't know, right? um, not quite. It's not quite like nature or nurture. It's extended. The idea is it's closely related to this idea of the extended mind, which is that cognition is not just something that happens within the mind. It extends out into the world. And the way that it does so here is that the meaning of mental representations depends in an important way on the way your environment is, right? Let's come up with some other examples of differences on Twin Earth. Maybe they have more differences than water and XYZ, right? Maybe they call what we call guitars, they call saxophones, right? Or what we use to refer to the word guitar doesn't refer to what we call a guitar, refers to what we call a saxophone. Then the meaning of the word guitar is of a large woodwind instrument instead of a stringed instrument, right? And how does this work? Like, how does the meaning actually get fixed by the environment? It's a matter of past associations with your environment. So someone on Twin Earth grows up using the word water to refer to XYZ. And so over the course of time, water comes to mean XYZ. Kim does something weird where he says, we have water on Earth, and we could call their Twin Earth water. which sounds ridiculous. But he goes on like this. Oh, on Twin Earth they have twatter. Like, I would have hyphenated that like tea water, for various reasons. One is that in some, it sounds like a certain word in uh certain certain vernacular styles of English. So I don't know if Kim realizes that this might sound funny to some people, but it did when I was reading through it. But maybe that's just because I'm rather immature for a philosophy professor. I don't know. So the point is that if content externalism is right, if we follow this thought experiment, the meaning of expressions don't supervene on internal physical psychological states. The meaning supervenes on features of the world too. And it follows from that the contents of our intentional states don't supervene on these internal states either. It means that intentional states have wide content. Yeah, okay, that's a good point, Angelica. Yeah, like that's what we call the euphemism treadmill, right? Words come to mean different things because of different sets of associations that we have now versus what people in the past might have had. I've made the example. Oh, I actually do have it here. I got some Sherlock Holmes, right? Let's see if we can find one. Find one of the ejaculations of Sherlock Holmes. Let's see. It's probably going to take me forever to do this, so. Oh, why is the Curse of the Baskervilles first? What volume is this? Oh, it's volume 2. Okay, you know what? This is hopeless, but you just take my word for it. If you read Sherlock Holmes, you will come upon certain points at which Sherlock says something, like, "Oh, the game's afoot," Holmes ejaculated. And you read this now in the 21st century, and you're like, "What? What just happened? Poor Watson, what just happened?" Right? In Victorian English and Edwardian English, to ejaculate meant to exclaim loudly, right? To be like, the game's afoot. That's what that meant. Now, that is of course not what it means. And there are many, many other examples you could think of, right? So words change over time, right? Like, I'm sure we can think of other examples. But that's my favorite one. Again, I guess I'm a little immature for a philosophy professor, but if you said that now, like, oh, I was talking to my friend and he said something and I ejaculated. What? People would look at you very, very funnily. Noah says, when I was reading The Great Gatsby, and a certain character dies, the author wrote, and the Holocaust was completed, which surprised me, and I had to ask my teacher what. Yeah. I believe the meaning that there is purification by fire. And nowadays it kind of means like a genocide, right? But it used to have a bit more of a specific meaning. Okay, he was shot. Oh, interesting. But yeah, words definitely change, and it's maybe not a matter of being on another planet like Twin Earth. Yeah, the term nuclear holocaust, yeah, by fire, because if there were a nuclear exchange, the world would be messed up and basically everything would kind of catch on fire and we'd all die of radiation poisoning, right? So nasty stuff. So so you get the idea, right? And it can happen because we inhabit different language worlds, not because we're on Twin Earth, but maybe because of the past, right? Words get appropriated and reappropriated too, right? Just to go back to what Wittgenstein famously said in the investigation, the meaning of a word is its use in a language game, right? And a language game is something we play with other speakers in an environment, right? So, if you buy this thought experiment, then you are a content externalist. Intentional states have wide content. Now, what about the metaphysics of these wide content states? And I apologize for the quote heavy bits that we're about to review, but I think they're important. Now, Putnam said famously that meanings just ain't in the head. Meaning supervenes on more than just the internal states of an organism. He is, yes, a quote machine. But if they're not in the head, where are they? They're outside. In what sense are they outside? Here are a few possibilities which might allow us to make sense of the idea that meaning is outside of the head. And these are all from 248 to 250. Kim says, first possibility, we might say that the belief that water and oil do not mix, for example, is constituted in part by water and oil, that the belief itself, in some sense, involves the actual stuff, water and oil, in addition to the person or her head having the belief. We didn't look at the arthritis and arthritis case, but so I'll just skip that. Thus, we have a simple explanation for just how your belief that water is wet differs from your twin Earth doppelganger's belief that tea water is wet. Yours includes water as a constituent, and hers includes twatter as a constituent. See, it just sounds silly. On this approach, then, beliefs extrude from the subject's head into the world, and there are no bounds to how far they can reach. The whole universe would, on this approach, be a constituent of your beliefs about the universe. Moreover, all beliefs about the universe would appear to have exactly the same constituent, namely the universe. This sounds absurd, and it is absurd. We can also see that this general approach would make the causal role of beliefs difficult to understand. Beliefs as either causes or effects. Okay, so option one basically has it that somehow the actual stuff that our beliefs are about figure into our belief. Like our beliefs include, in some sense, water and oil, in addition to holy good belief. This is it's almost Heideggerian. But Kim says this option is a little absurd, so it's not going to work. How about option two? We might consider the belief that water and oil do not mix as a relation holding between the subject on the one hand and water and oil on the other. Or alternatively, we take the belief as a relational property of the subject involving water and oil. That Socrates is married to Xanthippe is a relational fact. Socrates also has the relational property of being married to Xanthippe, and conversely, Xanthippe has the relational property of being married to Socrates. This approach makes causation of beliefs more tractable. We can ask, and will sometimes be able to answer, how a subject came to bear this belief relation to water and oil, just as we can ask how Xanthippe came to have the relational property of being married to Socrates. But what of the other determinants of content? As we saw, belief content is determined in part by the history of one's interaction with one's environment. And what of the social linguistic determinants, as in Burge's examples? These are the arthritis and arthritis examples that we didn't look at. It seems at least awkward to consider beliefs as relations with respect to these factors, as relations with respect to the history of your interaction with your environment, or social linguistic determinants, that is. So that gets us to option number 3. And this, as I say at the bottom, is probably the most promising one, according to Kim. This possibility is as follows. This possibility is to consider beliefs to be wholly internal to the subjects who have them, but consider their contents, when they are wide, as giving relational specifications or descriptions of the contents. On this view, beliefs may be neural states or other types of physical states of organisms to which they are attributed, and as such they are in the believer's head or mind. Contents, then, are construed as ways of specifying or describing the relational properties of these states. Wide contents are thus specifications in terms that involve factors and conditions external to the subject, both physical and social, both current and historical. We can refer to or pick out Socrates by relational descriptions, that is, in terms of his relational properties. For example, the husband of Xanthippe, the Greek philosopher who drank hemlock in a prison in Athens, Plato's mentor, and so on. But this does not mean that Xanthippe, hemlock, or Plato is a constituent part of Socrates, nor does it mean that Socrates is some kind of relational entity. Similarly, when we specify Jones's belief as the belief that water and oil do not mix, we are specifying this belief relationally by reference to water and oil, but this does not mean that water and oil are constituents of the belief, or that the belief itself is a relation to water and oil. Now, let's skip the narrow content section because I ran out of time. And also this chapter is already kind of long. And let's go to the causal explanatory efficacy of wide content. Why is this a good approach, and why specifically is 3 the most promising approach? Anyone have any thoughts on this? Actually, first, let's make sure that we're all on the same page with this approach, where we're talking about essentially beliefs still being in the head. That is, beliefs are still in the intentional system, but their content is wide. The content is fixed by relational. We'll go back one slide. By relational specifications or relational descriptions. Right. I can understand what Socrates is or who he is by understanding these relational properties, like that he was the husband of Xanthippe, the mentor of Plato, and the philosopher who died by hemlock, right? I can understand Socrates as that individual using those relational descriptions, but that does not mean that those descriptions are that Xanthippe or Plato are a part of Socrates. Socrates is just Socrates, but we understand who he is via these relational descriptions. So, are we good? We clear? Why is this a good approach? Can you think of another area of inquiry where we do this, where we specify properties relationally? Okay, Angelica's on board. Good, good, good. What other way do we specify properties relationally? Hint, scientists do a lot of this. Physics, yeah, chemistry, control conditions. These are good. Let's keep it simple, though. Let's say I want to measure something. Scientists measure a lot of stuff. Yeah, geographically, I guess. But let's say very simply, I want to measure something. This is the example in the textbook. Say I want to say, like, I measure something and I find that it's 2 meters long. How do I understand what that means? Well, I understand it as meaning that this object that is 2 meters long is twice the length of the standard meter, which is some bar kept somewhere in Paris at the like standards of weights and measurements building or whatever, right? So when I say something is 2 meters long, I'm saying, oh, well, it's twice the length of the standard meter. Or if I say something weighs 3 kilograms, it is thrice the mass of 1,000 cubic millimeters of water at sea level or whatever, right? So I'm defining these things relationally. So we do this in science all the time. And the standard meter itself is based upon how fast light goes in a certain speed of time through a vacuum, right? So everything is defined relationally. This is actually really big in metaphysics in recent years. Some have it that the only things that are actually real are relations. So that's why this is a good approach. It works in other areas. It works in the natural sciences, right? So maybe it can work for content, for mental states of intentional systems. Okay, any questions before we move on to the last little bit? I feel like I want to get more discussion going because it's only 4:30, only 4:36, well, 4:37 now. It just reminded me of another relational thing. Like, you ever been listening to the CBC? They don't do this anymore. They stopped doing this, but it used to be if you were listening to the CBC around midnight, they would say, like, at the tone, the time is exactly midnight. And then there would be a boop, and that would be midnight. And you could set your watch by that if you wanted to. That's another relational thing, right? So we're skipping the section on whether narrow content is possible, and we're going to look at some potential problems for content externalism. Oh, Jill remembers that. Yeah, it was quite recently, I think, that they stopped doing it. I don't know why they did, because I think it was kind of neat. Sometimes, I don't know, on a long road trip, might be driving late, and I'd be listening for that beep. Well, it's not quite. That's a good question, Jill. It's not quite being used in the same way, but it's these relations or relational descriptions, relational properties that determine the meaning of our representations, in whole or in part. So it doesn't mean the same thing, but the relations are where we get the content of our representations. Well, I guess all we have to work with in this case is representations. Like the standard meter represents a standard meter. But let's just say that it is the standard meter, and all other meters are representations of the standard meter, even though a meter is really like how far a photon goes in a vacuum in a very, very small slice of time. Well, what would it be? It would be 180,000th of a second, right? Because light travels at 180,000 meters per second in a vacuum. So 1 meter would be the distance light goes in 180,000th. Math. God. Oh, I hate math. But you get what I'm saying, right? Like if it goes that many, then so it's the distance it travels in 180,000th of a second. Yeah. I think. I'm not a physicist, so anyway. Like when I do math like that, my brain just kind of goes, ugh. So okay, problems. Causal explanatory efficacy of wide content. Here's what Kim says. Even if we acknowledge that common sense psychology individuates intentional states widely and formulates causal explanations of behavior in terms of wide content states, we might well ask whether this is an eliminable feature of such explanations. So common sense psychology is how we, again, make sense of the behavior of others. attribute beliefs to them and so forth. It's the system that we tend to operate under, right? And if we could say that maybe it individuates intentional states widely, it appeals to wide content states. Is this something we can do without, or is it necessary? Well, think back to the twin Earth thought experiment where water thoughts and tea water thoughts are not different in terms of the behavior they generate. Likewise with the fly schmy example, right? If you're a frog on Earth, seeing a fly causes you to, grab the fly with your tongue. If you're a frog on, Frog World, and you see a schmy, that causes the exact same behavior. So even if you attribute content to these two frogs widely, right? Our frog perceives a fly and eats a fly, and the other frog perceives a schmy and eats a schmy. They aren't different in terms of the behavior they generate. If you were to go to Twin Earth as a psychologist, you wouldn't need to rebuild your entire psychology from ground zero, right? So, I mean, do we really need wide content to explain at least behavior? If these supposedly two different mental states with wide content result in the same behavior? Kim says that in view of all this, or asks whether in view of all this, isn't it more appropriate to take the difference between water thoughts and tea water thoughts, or water desires and tea water desires, merely as a difference in the values of a contextual parameter to be fixed to suit the situations to which the theory is applied, rather than as an integral element of the theory itself? If this is correct, doesn't wide content drop out as part of the theoretical apparatus of psychological theory? Isn't this more like a variable rather than a fundamentally different kind of thing? That's one issue. And there are also some metaphysical worries here. The proximal causes of an action like raising an arm should be local, right? If I raise my arm and I'm an agent, if I'm really a being who acts on the basis of reasons, then my raising my arm, that intention has to come from in here. Whatever these events might represent on the outside is irrelevant to causing my behavior. So if the same neural event were to occur in another environment such that it had some kind of different wide content, it would still cause me to raise my arm, right? This, think if you just speak a different language, right? So the neural event in me that causes me to raise my arm is the same neural event in, say, or at least a token of a type of neural event in another speaker that causes her to raise her arm. But because she speaks a different language, this is not called an arm. It's called something else. So it would still cause her to raise her arm. And if this is true, then that means that the proximate causes of behavior, like intentions, really do supervene on internal physical states. Wide content states don't, right? They supervene on things outside of the organism, which is why they're wide, right? And this means that the wideness of wide content states isn't really relevant for causal explanations of behavior. So, what do we think? Are we following? Good. Excellent. Excellent. How could you answer this objection? You could say, well, when we apply folk psychological explanations or common sense psychological explanations, we're doing so for actions and not mere behavior. And remember, okay, Angelica's like, yes and no. So all this is to say is like, it's kind of a reply to really strong content externalism, like Putnam, right? Putnam's like meaning just ain't in the head. So even something like I intend to raise my arm, that meaning is the meaning of the content of that isn't in the head. But isn't it? That's what this reply is saying, right? The meaning of whatever intentionality that mental state has, if it's wide, like if I'm a speaker of a different language and I have different words for arm and raise and so forth, the wide content is going to be different, but I'm still going to put my arm up, right? The reply is that we apply folk psychology to explaining actions, not mere behavior. And I again, the Kim is kind of maybe a little bit vague here, but remember, actions are things that agents do, and agents always have reasons. Agents act on the basis of reasons, and those reasons are probably going to have wide content. Kim says behaviors explained in typical common sense explanations are given under wide descriptions, and we need wide contents to explain them. So the point of this reply is that we need wide content to explain wide behavior, right? Oh, so Noah says, whenever my friend stubs his toe, he says, ouch, my fingers. When I asked him why he doesn't say toes, he told me in his language they don't have a word for toes and they use the same word for fingers on your hands and toes. Yes, that's an example. That's a really good example. Yeah. Provided like, if he's saying it in English, it doesn't work in his example. But if you could compare what you say, ow, I stubbed my toe, to what he says in his native tongue, which translates to ow, I stubbed my fingers. Yeah, it shows that the wide content is different, but it still results in the same pain behavior. That's a really cool example. That just reminded me like how in some languages they have really weird words for things like that's really interesting how they just have like you have fingers but you also have fingers down there, like yeah, why call them, why have different words? In German, the word for gloves translates to hand shoes, right? Which is awesome. Like, oh, I got to put my hand shoes on, and you put your gloves on, right? Like amazing, right? I don't know. I'm gonna start calling them hand shoes. So I think we're nearly finished. Yeah, we're nearly there. Okay, how are we doing for time? Pretty good. Let's talk about self-knowledge, wide content and self-knowledge, and think back to the twin Earth experiment. So Kim says on page 256, how do we know that Mary believes that water is wet and that Mary's twin on twin Earth believes tea water is wet? Because we know that Mary's environment contains water and that Mary's twin's environment contains tea water. Now consider the matter from Mary's point of view. How does she know that she believes water is wet? How does she know the content of her own thoughts? And you might recall here that one of the potential marks of the mental that we reviewed back in chapter 1 is that we have this sort of direct privileged access to our own mental states. Now, this is not to say that this access is perfect, but I know my mind more or less directly. I don't know your mind that way. Like if I stub my toe or my foot fingers, I just know that I'm in pain. But if you stub your toe, I can only know that you're in pain by observing your behavior or asking you what happened, right? Not like that with my mind. So now think back to Mary. Kim says, it seems plausible to think that in order for her to know that her thought is about water, not about tea water, she is in the same epistemic situation that we are in with respect to the content of her thought. We know her thoughts are about water because her Earth has HTO and not XYZ. But how does Mary know that her thoughts are about water H2O and not T water or XYZ. Why doesn't she too have to know, Kim says, that if she is to know that her thought is about water, not tea water? And how can she know something like that without observation or evidence? We know, again, because we know that Earth has H2O and twin Earth has XYZ. But imagine this, imagine that where here we go. Yeah, this is what I wanted to get to. Imagine that Mary travels between Earth and twin Earth. So Earth and twin Earth are close enough together that Mary can, maybe she does some sci-fi stuff, like she takes the teletransporter or she goes at warp speed or something, right? So she goes to Earth and twin Earth, and because these planets are exactly alike in every respect, except one has H2O and the other has XYZ, and at least on our level of existence, we can't tell the difference. After a while, Mary forgets which planet she's on. So now we can ask, as Kim does, can she know directly and without further investigation whether her thoughts, say the thought she expresses when she mutters to herself, the tap water in this fancy hotel doesn't taste so good, are about water or tea water? It would seem that, as I've said at the top, she's in danger of losing her privileged epistemic access to her own mental states. And that's what this little modification shows us. Her knowledge of her thoughts' contents, whether she's talking about water or tea water, is on equal footing with the third person knowledge of her thoughts contents. She's risking losing that privileged epistemic access. If Mary forgot what planet she was on, twin Earth or our Earth, she wouldn't be able to know whether her thoughts are about water or whether her thoughts about water are about H2O or XYZ. She would have to do some further investigation, maybe look at it under the microscope or do some kind of spectronomy or something, right? Now, if all of this is right, then content externalism entails that a lot of our self-knowledge isn't direct at all. It's like other kinds of knowledge that we need evidence to to infer that knowledge, or we need to deduce that knowledge. It's not like self-knowledge. That is to say, Kim writes, content externalism appears to be prima facie incompatible with privileged first-person access to one's own mind. And content externalists certainly do have a lot of replies to this, but this is all beyond the scope of this chapter and indeed this class. But yeah, it's an interesting, yeah, you're right, Jack. It's an interesting objection. I don't know how I feel about it because kind of like, well, there is a sense in which I do have a privileged access to my own mind, but it's not like Cartesian, right? It's not like, oh, I think therefore I am. Oh, I know I'm definitely an ego, a thinking thing. No, you don't know that. What if it's an illusion, right? And we'll get to that next time, because next time we're going to talk about consciousness, and we're going to get to talk a little bit about Daniel Dennett, obviously, who thinks of consciousness as kind of like an illusion or a useful fiction. Yeah, the last two lectures are going to be awesome. I'll tell you what, I had a heck of a time reading through this chapter. I kept alternating between reading a bit and then going and doing something else because, frankly, it was a little boring. But I thought I better teach it because it is an important question, right? If we think back to what we were talking about with the Turing machines and with the Chinese room, I briefly mentioned the symbol grounding problem. We don't have this problem when it comes to artificial systems because we can decide what means what. We can say 0 means false and 1 means true, right? We decide that. But where do the meanings of our mental states come from? I think that they are probably, I guess I am an externalist, right? I do think that they are grounded in an important way in our causal historical interactions with the environment. And does that mean I might lose my privileged access to my own mind? Well, did I even have such privileged access in the first place? Probably not, right? Probably I do know my mind more directly than I know yours, but also the way I know my own mind does not accurately represent the way my mind is and the way it works, right? And that's probably a big mistake that Descartes made. And that's something that Nietzsche actually points out when he's railing against all of the great philosophers, like, oh, I think, therefore I am. Well, you're just assuming that your own experience of yourself is accurate. Like, what if it's not like that? What if the Buddhists are right and the self is an illusion, right? Anyway, the last two chapters are going to be fun. I'm really excited. Oh, that's good. 14 bucks. Yeah. I got my copy of the Gay Science for free. I got it right here. Somebody was like leaving the office, or they're like, here's some books. I was like, okay, I don't have the Gay Science. I'm taking this. Free. Absolutely free. And it's Kaufman. Yeah, it's Kaufman translation, who's like the guy who kind of repopularized Nietzsche, because he had the unfortunate associations with Nazism thanks to his sister. Nietzsche would have hated the Nazis, in fact. And I think I have a couple copies of Zarathustra, Beyond Good and Evil. I've got doubles. I've got some doubles of different translations. But yeah, Nietzsche was fun. I mean, don't we all, when we're undergrad philosophy majors, go through our sort of existentialist phase, right? And we read Nietzsche and Kierkegaard, and then we graduate and we read Sartre and de Beauvoir and Heidegger and maybe some Camus, right? We've all done it. Yeah, it has. Yeah. Okay, so Jack Reagan says social media has ruined those. Yeah, but Jack Yeager is on an excellent existentialist kick, which is great. You know what? Since we have time, do you know what social media has ruined the most? Stoicism. It's like, it's just a bunch of tech bros. Like, oh man, I'm going to tell you my Stoic secrets. Here's my top 5 Stoic practices for mindful business interactions. Like, oh, get out of here. Like, ugh, it's disgusting. Although if I'm to be a Stoic, I guess I shouldn't react that strongly to that, but still, Marcus Aurelius is turning in his grave because of these tech bros. Anyway, that's it for today. Not yet. I'm trying to get those done as quickly as I can. You will have them back before the exam period begins. I'd like to get them all done and back to you over the weekend, and that way you have the exam period to complete the paper. Now, feel free to get started if you want, especially in terms of further research. But Karanvir and I will have those done for you as soon as possible. All right. Well, I guess I'll go and make sure everything's in order with the grade book and those quizzes. But that's it for now. So have a good rest of your day, everyone, and I'll see you on Wednesday when we will begin to discuss the mysteries of consciousness. So thanks, everyone, and see you next time.